This video recording is Anatomy and Physiology of the Male and Female Reproductive Systems, Part 1 of 2. The reproductive organs in both male and female reproductive systems are referred to as gonads. In the male, those are the testes. In the female, those are the ovaries. The gonads are responsible for producing gametes, which are sperm in males and ova in females. All gametes are haploid cells with the same number of chromosomes, which is 23. You'll recall that a regular somatic cell has 46 chromosomes. That's why gametes have half the number of chromosomes, so that when an egg and a sperm get together, they will combine to make a zygote, which has a complete set of chromosomes. Gonads produce and secrete specific steroid hormones also, mainly testosterone in males and estrogen and progesterone in females. All other reproductive organs, including ducts, glands, and external genitalia, are important in the reproductive process. The male's sole reproductive function is to produce gametes and deliver them to the female reproductive tract in order for fertilization to occur. The female reproductive system is specifically designed to receive gametes from the male and to provide a protective environment in the uterus for the fertilized ovum, which is at that point referred to as a zygote, will develop into an embryo and then into a fetus until birth. The male reproductive system develops embryologically as the result of the SRY gene, which is a special area on the Y chromosome, which will help a male develop when conception has occurred. If we look at this sagittal view of the male reproductive system, we can see that it includes at the bottom of this picture the testes, which are housed in a structure referred to as the scrotum. The testes have on their surface a special structure called the epididymis. And we know that the prefix epi means above, and the rest of the word didymis literally translates to the twins. So the epididymis is located above the twins. There is a passageway or duct that will carry sperm to the next structure, and that duct, if you follow it superiorly from the epididymis, is the vas deferens or ductus deferens. The ductus deferens will join the seminal vesicle or seminal gland, which will enter into the prostate gland, where that duct now becomes the ejaculatory duct and will join together with the prostatic urethra, and then that prostatic urethra, as it enters the penis, is then known as the penile urethra. You'll notice there's a little bulbourethral gland, which also has a duct which enters into the penile urethra, and the penis includes spongy tissue. There are two types. There is an area of spongy tissue that lies more dorsally on the penis, that is the corpus cavernosum, and then there's an area of tissue that surrounds the penile urethra known as the corpus spongiosum. There's an expansion of the penis towards the distal aspect known as the glans penis, and the skin covering the glans penis has an inner membranous lining that forms the prepuce or foreskin, and then of course we get to the external urethral orifice. Let's take a closer look at the scrotum. The scrotum is a muscular sac where the testes are housed, and the skin of the scrotum is highly pigmented. The testes have to be 3.6 to 7.2 degrees Fahrenheit cooler than core body temperature in order for the sperm to remain alive. And the scrotum has a connective tissue septum or wall that divides that sac into two separate areas, one for each testis. There is a special muscle that actually arises from bands that came from the internal oblique muscle that go through the superficial inguinal ring at the end of the inguinal canal, and that forms the cremaster muscle, which can act to either raise or lower the testes to help regulate temperature. There's also another muscle called the dartos muscle that is found in the superficial fascia deep to the skin of the scrotum that can thicken to, again, bring the testes closer to the body, or thin and relax the skin to lower the testes, again helping to regulate the temperature of the testes. If you look at this picture, you'll notice that on the left side there is a ring around the structure of the spermatic cord, which includes the cremaster muscle, and on the right side you'll also see that in that spermatic cord is where we find the ductus deferens or vas deferens traveling, as well as autonomic nerve fibers and blood vessels, including a special plexus or network of venous blood vessels known as the pampiniform plexus. Let's take a closer look at the testes, which are male gonads that are responsible for producing gametes known as sperm and male sex hormones. Testes are paired organs surrounded by a connective tissue layer that is actually a serous membrane. The tunica vaginalis is the outer membrane of connective tissue, and they don't have a visceral and parietal name for this. They just call it the tunica vaginalis, whether it's actually on the surface of the testis or lining the cavity. And they actually call the cavity of the tunica vaginalis. Deep to that layer of connective tissue, we find more connective tissue that is referred to as the tunica albuginea, which is a white layer of connective tissue that invaginates and goes into the testis to form about 250 little lobes called lobules, and within each of those 250 little lobules we find anywhere between 1 and 4 tiny tubules referred to as seminiferous tubules. And the seminiferous tubules contain spermatogenic, which are sperm-forming cells, embedded in cells known as cystenocytes or Sertoli cells, which have the nickname of being called nurse cells. And the Sertoli cells or cystenocytes are responsible for creating stability for those developing sperm. And there's also a blood testis barrier that is formed by these cystenocytes, and they make an androgen binding hormone to maintain high levels of testosterone for sperm, And they also secrete a hormone known as inhibin. Inhibin has the job of inhibiting the release of follicle stimulating hormone when there are enough sperm. And the sustentiocytes, I should just call them Sertoli cells, that's easier. The Sertoli cells can also phagocytize defective sperm cells. The spermatogenic cells are stem cells or germ cells that are called spermatogonia. They are the least mature and they are responsible for spermatogenesis, which is the creation of sperm. We also find in these seminiferous tubules myoid cells, which are responsible for squeezing sperm through the tubules, because when sperm are produced, they don't mature in the seminiferous tubules. Another type of cell that we find in the seminiferous tubules are interstitial cells, and the interstitial cells are also known as cells of Leydig. Those are responsible for producing testosterone. Spermatogenesis, or the creation of sperm cells, is going to involve not only mitosis, but also a special kind of cell division where the number of chromosomes is limited in gametes, and that is a special division known as meiosis. So we still have mitosis, but we also add meiosis to the mix. And in males, this occurs in the seminiferous tubules. And what's going to happen is those spermatogenic cells, known as spermatogonia, are going to give rise by way of mitosis to two types of spermatocytes. We have type A and type B. Type B are going to become primary spermatocytes, while type A are going to remain as spermatogonia, so they can keep going through mitosis. But the type B primary spermatocytes are then going to undergo a special type of cell division known as meiosis. And during meiosis, primary spermatocytes will turn into secondary spermatocytes, which will form spermatids. And spermatids will undergo a special process known as spermiogenesis, where the spermatids become sperm. So those are important concepts to keep in mind. Remember, spermatogenesis is going to be where stem cells undergo mitosis to create more of themselves, and in the process, we get spermatocytes. Type A spermatocytes remain as spermatogonia, but type B spermatocytes become primary spermatocytes, which are eventually going to turn into sperm when spermatids undergo the process of becoming physical sperm, which is spermiogenesis. So keep those two terms separate in your head. Spermatogenesis, the overall process; spermiogenesis, spermatids become sperm. We're going to take a closer look at this process in the next slide. We're going to discuss the process of meiosis, and there's a chart on the left-hand side of this slide that compares meiosis on the right part of the chart to mitosis, which is on the left-hand side of that chart. Each begins with a parent cell, which in meiosis would be the B-type primary spermatocyte, undergoing chromosome replication. So we're going to make a copy of the chromosomes, just like we would if we were doing mitosis. However, meiosis has two portions to it, and it's divided into meiosis 1 and meiosis 2 just to keep things straight. So with meiosis 1, what happens is the replicated chromosomes are going to seek out their homologous pairs. And homologous chromosomes are pairs of chromosomes, one from each parent, that are similar in length, centromere position, and gene sequence. Now, although they carry the same position and gene sequence, the specific DNA sequences may differ, resulting in what we call different alleles, which will express slightly different traits. And as these homologous chromosomes get together, they form a special structure called a tetrad, because now we've got 4 sister chromosomes, a pair of homologous chromosomes. And so when that tetrad forms, they form by a process called synapses, where they're kind of buttoned together. And pieces of the chromosomes can sometimes actually change places as they wrap around one another. And that also allows for a mixing of genetic information. So we now have these special structures called tetrads in prophase 1. In metaphase 1 of meiosis 1, those tetrads will now line along the equator. Remember, they are homologous pairs of chromosomes that are joined together. In anaphase 1 and telophase 1, those tetrads, the pairs of homologous chromosomes, are now going to be split apart. Now we have 2 individual daughter cells from meiosis 1, and a haploid chromosomal number now exists because the still united sister chromatids are considered a single chromosome, even though there's twice the DNA in each. And when those get split in meiosis 2, that's how we generate a truly haploid gamete. And that's what happens in meiosis 2. Those sister chromatids will separate, becoming individual chromosomes during meiosis 2 in anaphase 2. And that maintains a constant number of chromosomes from one generation of cells to the next. Now, in the production of sperm, we go from those individually created haploid cells, the daughter cells at the end of meiosis 2. Those are our truly haploid cells that are now going to go through the process of spermiogenesis. And this happens around puberty, which is usually about the age of 14 for males, and continues throughout the life of the male. So spermiogenesis is the process of the spermatid losing the excess cytoplasm that would be around the nucleus of that spermatid and developing a tail to become a functional sperm cell. So healthy adult males actually produce about 400 million sperm every day. The head of the sperm has that haploid nucleus with just a little bit of cytoplasm, and it also has a special structure called an acrosome. And that acrosome contains hydrolytic enzymes that are going to be used to help permeate and enter into an ovum, an egg. There's a midpiece of the sperm that has a lot of mitochondria surrounding it. It's called the mitochondrial sheath that is used to produce energy for the tail, which is the flagellum, and the tail, which has an axial filament, a protein filament inside of it to help whip it around and make it motile to get to the egg. Remember that tail needs energy, and that's why you see that special mitochondrial sheath just distal to the head of the sperm. From the seminiferous tubules, sperm next go into a group of straight ducts known as the rete testes, and then into the epididymis. The epididymis consists of about 20 feet of coiled ducts where sperm will mature, and that process takes about 20 days. Smooth muscle helps propel the sperm, which are actually ejaculated from the epididymis, not from the testes. From the epididymis, there is a muscular tube that extends away from the epididymis called the ductus deferens or vas deferens, and the vas deferens with blood vessels, nerves, and connective tissues form the spermatic cord, which I showed you in an earlier slide. The inguinal canal provides the pathway for the vas deferens to travel into the pelvic cavity over and behind the urinary bladder and expands into a structure known as the ampulla of the vas deferens. You can see that in this picture on the slide because we're looking at a posterior view of the urinary bladder. So the ampulla forms a reservoir for sperm where other fluids can be added to form semen. After sexual excitation, when an orgasm is achieved in the male reproductive system, that causes the ejaculation of semen. Now, sperm only make up about 5% of semen, which includes fluids from 3 different types of accessory glands. Seminal vesicles contribute 60 to 70% of the volume of fluid for semen. Seminal vesicle fluid includes fructose, citric acid, a yellow pigment that actually fluoresces, which is why you see the picture on this slide, an enzyme called vesiculase, which helps coagulate semen, and prostaglandins, which are important in enhancing the mobility of sperm as well as enhancing their ability to fertilize an egg. The ampulla of the vas deferens and the seminal vesicle ducts join to form the ejaculatory duct. The seminal vesicles are lined with secretory pseudostratified columnar epithelium. The prostate gland is an accessory gland that sits inferior to the urinary bladder, and it secretes a slightly acidic fluid with citrate, which helps sperm by acting as a nutrient for them, and several enzymes, including prostate-specific antigen. Prostate-specific antigen is normally going to measure at 4.0 or lower in most men under the age of 50. However, for a lot of men as they age, their prostate gland tends to get slightly enlarged, and prostate-specific antigen values may increase over time. That's normal. Prostate-specific antigen, if it takes a big jump over a short period of time, could indicate prostate cancer. And prostate cancers are fortunately usually very slow growing and may actually never present a threat to that male patient. It's very commonly said that a lot of men may die with prostate cancer, but not necessarily from prostate cancer. It tends to remain encapsulated in the prostate gland itself. It can metastasize and spread to other tissues, but it's very, very slow growing. The bulbourethral glands are glands that produce a thick, clear fluid for the purpose of lubricating the penile urethra as well as cleansing it during sexual excitation. So that fluid contributes very slightly to semen. Clotting factors help semen coagulate during ejaculation to help it stick to the walls of the vagina, and then enzymes inside the vagina will actually cause it to decoagulate so that the sperm can become more mobile and move towards an ovum. The penis surrounds the urethra, which is the last duct in the male reproductive system. The penis consists of 3 chambers of tissues. The corpora cavernosa is located laterally and is very large. It's lateral to the corpus spongiosum, which surrounds the urethra and also provides a raised ridge on the surface of the penis. The glans penis is actually a continuation of the corpus spongiosum and is covered by a foreskin, which is also known as the prepuce, which is highly innervated. Now, when sexual excitation occurs, that is a parasympathetic reflex, and arousal and REM sleep can also cause this parasympathetic reflex to occur. What happens during erection is nitric oxide will be released, causing local vasodilation. As blood fills into the chambers of tissue that make up the penis will fill with blood as it becomes engorged and becomes erect, and that will start to press down on the little venules, causing vasocongestion. So the pressure compresses the venules to prevent venous drainage. When ejaculation occurs, that's occurring as a very short-lived sympathetic response. And semen cannot enter the urinary bladder because there is a smooth muscle sphincter, that's the internal urethral sphincter of the bladder, that will contract during ejaculation, so it closes off. So semen can't back up into the urinary bladder. Because there's a lot to go over with hormonal regulation of the male reproductive system, you won't see me, but you'll hear me at this point. And I've got a picture to the far left of this slide, and you can follow along. If we start with number 1, which is actually just to the right of the picture, you'll notice that number 1 really should be on the hypothalamus because it starts with the hypothalamus releasing gonadotropic releasing hormone, which then goes through the hypophyseal portal veins to get to the adenohypophysis, which we know is the anterior pituitary. In turn, the anterior pituitary will release follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. And follicle-stimulating hormone indirectly stimulates spermatogenesis by stimulating the cystinocytes, which are Sertoli cells, to release a special hormone called androgen-binding protein. An androgen-binding protein keeps the concentration of testosterone in that area of the spermatogenic cells high, which will stimulate spermatogenesis. So follicle-stimulating hormone actually enhances the stimulatory effects of testosterone when it comes to producing sperm. Now, luteinizing hormone will bind to the interstitial cells of Leydig, and that will cause them to secrete testosterone and actually a tiny little bit of estrogen. And those locally rising levels of testosterone are going to trigger spermatogenesis. So with testosterone, not only does it trigger spermatogenesis, it also stimulates the maturation of sex organs and the development and maintenance of secondary sex characteristics, including libido, which is the sex drive. So rising levels of testosterone will actually feed back to inhibit the release of gonadotropic releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, and will also act directly on the adenohypophysis or anterior pituitary to inhibit the release of follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. And there's a protein that's also produced by the Sertoli cells, and that protein is called inhibin. It kind of serves to regulate the production of sperm. When sperm count is high, more inhibin is released, acting on the anterior pituitary to prevent the release of follicle stimulating hormone, and also acting on the hypothalamus to prevent the release of gonadotropic releasing hormone. And so the inhibitory effect of testosterone and inhibin on the hypothalamus, even though it's not illustrated, it will inhibit it. And when sperm count goes below 20 million milliliters, or 20 million per milliliter, then the inhibin secretion will decline very rapidly. So we can see that there are some main players in this system. The production of gametes and sex hormones is going to involve the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary, and the testes for the release of follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. And that hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis specifically is the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary, which you remember is the adenohypophysis, and the interstitial cells of Leydig in the testes. And again, we already mentioned how those hormones are going to be involved. Without gonadotropic releasing hormone that causes the hypothalamus to cause the release of follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, ultimately from the anterior pituitary, what's going to happen is the gonadotropins, those sex hormones, will decrease, the testes will atrophy, and sperm and testosterone production will stop. If luteinizing hormone is decreased, well, how is that going to affect the levels of testosterone? Remember that testosterone is important for stimulating the maturation of sex organs. That is the male pattern of development, and it also will develop and maintain secondary sex characteristics, and it will stimulate protein synthesis in skeletal muscle. It contributes to male sexual behavior and spermatogenesis. So know that even with the males, we have very low levels of estrogen. As I mentioned earlier, with females, there are actually low levels of testosterone. But again, if luteinizing hormone is decreased, well, that's going to cause the interstitial cells of Leydig, which are found outside of the seminiferous tubules, by the way, that's going to cause that decrease in testosterone levels. And without testosterone levels being high enough, then all of the maturation and development and protein synthesis that would normally occur for males would not occur. So that can be a problem. And I'm back. So we're going to look at testicular and prostate cancer next. The testicles actually form in an unborn baby's lower abdominal region, and during the last few months of pregnancies, those testicles will start to descend and move downward. They'll move through the inguinal canal and they'll descend into the scrotum. With an undescended testicle, that process either stops completely or is delayed, and an undescended testicle is referred to as cryptorchidism. Undescended testicles are actually the most important risk factor when it comes to testicular cancer in young males. With prostate cancer, it's a much more common cancer in men, and it arises from the prostate gland, which is a walnut-sized gland just inferior to the bladder. It often grows very, very slowly and may never present a threat to that male patient. With early detection and treatment, there are high cure rates, and most men who have prostate cancer will die with it rather than from it. This is going to take us to the female reproductive system, and we're going to start with the external genitalia first, understanding that the female reproductive system must produce gametes and hormones, but must also support and deliver a fetus. We're going to start our journey with the external genitalia of the female reproductive system, with the vulva, which is a collective term for all of the external structures. And this includes the mons pubis, which you can see at the top of the picture, on the top picture. To the left, it's labeled. And the term mons pubis literally means pubic mountain. And moving to the labia majora, those are the outer lips, if you will, that surround the vaginal orifice, as well as the external urethral orifice, the clitoris, the labia minora. So that labia majora you can see on the outer portion on both sides. Now there is an inner structure, the labia minora, which protect the urethra, protect the vaginal orifice. And if we look from the labia minora just inferior to the clitoris, going down to the posterior aspect of the labia minora, that area is referred to as the vestibule. That's a doorway. And the vestibule includes the area where the external urethral orifice is found. The glans clitoris is the counterpart to the penis, and if a woman has not had this membrane ruptured, just internal to the vaginal orifice is a mucous membrane referred to as the hymen, and the hymen will rupture with really physical exercise. It can rupture with intercourse or anything that penetrates the vaginal orifice. There are two little pea-sized glands on either side of the vaginal orifice, and you can see them on the bottom picture to the left. And those are Bartholin's glands. They produce a clear mucus-like fluid that helps to lubricate the vagina during sexual intercourse. On this picture, you can see the orifice for the anus and get a better understanding of how close that is to the external urethral orifice, which is why it's easier for women to get urinary tract infections. And by the way, the area between the anus and the labia majora, that is the perineum, and that can sometimes be cut during a vaginal delivery of a child. They used to cut them all the time. It was a procedure called an episiotomy, but then they learned that episiotomies were not necessarily helpful, nor were they beneficial for the mom when she delivered her child vaginally. This is going to take us to the female gonads, which are the ovaries. They're paired gonads that are found on either side of the uterus. They're shaped like almonds and are about as twice the size of an almond each. And each ovary is held in place by several ligaments. There's an ovarian ligament, a suspensory ligament, the mesovarium, and the suspensory ligament and mesovarium are part of a broad ligament that supports the uterine tubes, the uterus, and the vagina. The blood supply for the ovaries comes by way of ovarian arteries, which branch off of the abdominal aorta, and there is also an ovarian branch of uterine arteries. Those vessels travel through the suspensory ligament as well as through the mesovaria, which is that flat connective tissue. Each ovary is also surrounded by a fibrous tunica albuginea, which is then covered by germinal cuboidal epithelium, which forms an outer layer. The germinal layer is a continuation of the peritoneum. So that means that the eggs that are produced on the outside of the ovary, and then when the ovum is ovulated and comes off of the surface of the ovary, it's going to travel next into the uterine tubes or fallopian tubes. So we're going to take a closer look at that as well. So here is a microscopic picture of an ovary. You can see the surface epithelium on the outside, the tunica albuginea. There's a cortex and a medullary region. Ovarian follicles are shown at different stages of development, and they will contain immature ova. The follicles for the ovaries, remember, a follicle is just a place where something is going to develop. We have hair follicles, we have lymphoid follicles. So there's a follicle, again, it's just a space where something's going to develop. So again, the ovary has an outer cortex that houses forming gametes, an inner medullary region that contains large blood vessels and nerves. The ovarian follicles are tiny little sac-like structures that are actually embedded in the cortex, and they contain immature eggs, which are technically known as oocytes, encased by one or more layers of very different cells. Each month, a ripened follicle will eject the oocyte in an event called ovulation. In terms of the female duct system, the uterine tube does not have direct contact with the ovaries. I know it kind of looks like it does in this picture, but it really doesn't. If this is an ovary and my hand were the end of a fallopian tube, it doesn't directly contact. It kind of hovers nearby. And so the ovulated oocyte is going to be released into the peritoneal cavity, and some of the oocytes never make it into the uterine or fallopian tubes. They just never make it in there. They go into the cavity, the abdominopelvic cavity, and they just disintegrate. So this tubular system includes the uterine tubes or fallopian tubes, the uterus, and the vagina. Those make up the female duct system. This is actually kind of a better picture of the uterine tube and the ovary, and you can see that ovarian ligament connecting the ovary to the uterus on the right-hand side, that whitish portion coming off the ovary to the right. And then to the left, we see these little finger-like projections coming off, which side? I guess it would be the, yeah, I'm trying to do it like the picture. We've got these little finger-like projections coming off of the uterine tube. Those are fimbriae. And those fimbriae, I'm sorry, it's fimbriae, not fimbriae, fimbriae, are finger-like projections that are going to have kind of like a wave-like motion. So when an ovum is extruded from the surface of the ovary, the wave-like motion of the fimbriae will draw that ovum into the fallopian tube. Another word for fallopian tube is oviduct. That receives that structure, those uterine tubes slash fallopian tubes slash oviducts. Those are going to receive the ovulated oocyte, and they're the usual site of fertilization. Fertilization does usually not occur in the uterus. It can, but it usually occurs in the fallopian tubes. Now, sometimes fertilization can occur outside of the fallopian tube in the uterus and actually occur in the abdominopelvic cavity, in which case it usually will disintegrate, but there have been some circumstances where that fertilized ovum, the zygote, attaches itself to a structure within the abdominal pelvic cavity and may actually start to grow. That occurrence is what we refer to as an ectopic pregnancy. Each of the fallopian tubes is approximately 10 centimeters or 4 inches in length. It extends from the area surrounding the ovary to the superior portion of the uterus. And there are different regions of the uterine tube. There is the infundibulum, which is that funnel-shaped opening where the fimbriae are located. There's also an ampulla, which is an enlargement of the uterine tube, which makes about half of the length of the tube. And it's within the ampulla that fertilization usually occurs. There's also a narrow medial third that goes in towards the uterus that's called the isthmus, and that isthmus is going to empty into that superolateral region of the uterus. So during ovulation, the fimbriae of the uterine tube will hopefully generate the motion for the oocyte to come into the uterine tube, and once that happens, the oocyte will be carried along towards the uterus by smooth muscle peristalsis and by the action of cilia on the simple columnar epithelium that lines the uterine tube. There's actually ciliated simple columnar epithelium in the uterine tube. The uterus is a hollow, thick-walled muscular organ, and it is designed to receive, to retain, and maintain by nourishing the fertilized ovum. Normally, the position of a uterus in the female body is anteverted. It's just inclined forward. Okay, that's anteversion. Sometimes it can be retroverted or inclined backward. In severe cases, sometimes the uterus can be retroflexed, and that's when it's really bent backwards. There are different regions of the uterus that we can see in this picture. The upper region that's curved of the uterus is referred to as the fundus of the uterus. The major portion of the uterus is referred to as the body. There is a narrowing inferiorly of the uterus, which I don't see labeled on here, but that's called the isthmus. And then the cervix is the inferior narrow neck, which is an outlet for the uterus that projects into the vagina. And the cervical canal communicates with the vagina by way of an opening in the cervix, referred to as the external os, where it meets the vagina, and then there's also an internal os where the cervix has an opening into the body of the vagina. Cervical glands are going to secrete mucus that blocks the entry of sperm except during mid-cycle of a menstrual cycle, which we're going to talk about soon. We're going to take a look at the wall of the uterus, starting from the outside and working our way in. The three layers of the wall of the uterus include the external perimetrium, which is the outermost serous layer or visceral peritoneum. The myometrium is a middle bulky layer consisting of smooth muscle fibers that have interlaced and will contract rhythmically during childbirth. The endometrium forms the inner mucosal lining. It's made up of simple columnar epithelium on top of a very thick lamina propria, and it is in the endometrial where a fertilized egg, the zygote, will actually burrow into and remain during development. The endometrium has two portions. There is the stratum functionalis, or functional layer, which is going to change in response to the cycles of different hormones coming from the ovaries. And the stratum basalis, or basal layer, is going to form a new stratum functionalis after menstruation. The stratum basalis is actually unresponsive to ovarian hormones. You'll notice I haven't spoken about ovarian hormones just yet. That's because we're going to do that in the second part of this series. The next organ we're going to discuss is the vagina, which is the entrance to the reproductive tract for the female, and again is where the hymen, that very thin mucous membrane that can rupture easily, is found, and the bulbourethral glands are also found near the entrance to the vagina. The vagina is a muscular canal that functions as a birth canal, functions as a passageway for menstrual flow, and functions as an organ of copulation. There is a superior fornix of the vagina, which is that indented region where it meets the cervix. If you look closely at this picture, you'll see that the cervix comes down and there's an indented area around that opening for the cervix and around the cervix, and that indented area is the superior fornix. There are rugae, which are folds inside the vagina for longitudinal expansion, because normally the vagina is 3 to 4 inches in length. During sexual excitation in the female, the vagina actually becomes engorged with blood and lengthens internally. Vaginal secretions are acidic in adult females. They're alkaline in adolescents. The mucosa near the vaginal orifice will form that incomplete partition, as we mentioned before, called the hymen. That's just a little mucous membrane that can either rupture with intercourse or, as I said before, with really active physical exercise. So again, that vaginal fornix is the upper end of the vagina surrounding the cervix. This is the last slide for this group of slides for the male and female reproductive system. We're going to move on to part 2 of 2.